Okay, welcome to another episode of I Love Youth Work. It's Bob Singer and Dave McQueen, as you know. And today is a special episode because we have a special guest. Today we have Adam Nichols, who is the CEO of Changemakers. So we're very privileged that he spared some time to speak with us today, and hopefully this will be a valuable episode with lots of information for you to glean from. You got something to say there?
Yeah, not hopefully, because hope is a strategy for losers. We are going to have an excellent episode today, and we are excited to have Adam here. I'm not going to tell you too much about him. We're going to start interviewing, ask him some fantastic questions, and I know you will be. I know I'm going to benefit from it. I don't care about anyone else. I know I'm definitely going to benefit from it. So we're looking forward to this episode.
So, although it's a bit higgledy-piggledy, hopefully, I like the word hopefully, because hope is a good thing.
Hope is not a strategy.
But I'm going to say a few things about Adam because I think it's important that we introduce him and kind of put it into context of where this information is coming. As you know, it's a light-hearted episode of I Love Youth Work, but at the same time we've got a serious and important time in the youth work field, and Adam is definitely a key player in that. So from his bio, you can kind of pull that off the kind of website, but I know Dave and I are very privileged because let's face it, there are certain people that have dedicated their life to kind of youth leadership, and it's about respecting them and people who have dedicated their time to it. Adam started as a community organiser and then worked for the National Union of Students, I think it was, around careers. But he's been a key player in, sometimes behind the scenes, in key policy situations and projects around enterprise and citizenship, especially rollout in schools. And now as a CEO of Changemakers, he's advised governments and prime ministers, this prime minister and previous prime ministers. But why Dave and I are here is about his dedication to youth leadership and the contribution he's made. So we're very grateful to kind of share this time and perhaps get some insights and discuss where youth work is today and the opportunities that youth workers and the youth field have.
Yes, and I just want to add on a side note that one of the beauties about being in leadership is about patience. Both of us support Liverpool, so we know a lot about patience, so I'm looking forward to hearing what Adam has to say in our interview.
So we're actually in Arsenal territory here. I'm in Arsenal territory here with two Liverpool fans. So unfortunately, yes, Adam is a Liverpool fan, so maybe we'll discuss that and some of the disappointment that they've had over the last few seasons. So Adam, welcome to I Love
Thanks, guys.
Right, so let's kick off. I know we've kind of like introduced you, Adam, but what would you say is your reason or your purpose for being the CEO of Changemakers?
Well, Changemakers is about unlocking young people's leadership potential, and I guess for me personally, that's one of the most important things that we need to do as a society. I think we've seen a real collective failure of leadership over the last few years. You've seen that in the political sphere, you've seen it in the financial sphere. Looking at the longer term, you see it in the context of international development and the environment, and I think the sense in which a lot of young people now feel let down by the generation that's preceded them. So what we're about as an organisation, and I guess what I'm about myself, is trying to ensure that the next generation of leaders are equipped to make better decisions and to lead the world more effectively.
Okay.
So can you tell us a bit about Changemakers and what Changemakers does?
Yeah, so we do a couple of things really. So we work directly with young people who've got leadership potential, who've already perhaps demonstrated leadership spark, as we call it. And we give them quite an intensive development programme, which involves training, coaching. It involves them having a placement in an organisation where they can actually lead a project and exercise leadership and hopefully influence that organisation as well. Sorry, I said hopefully, Dave. And then the second thing we do is that we actually work with organisations to try and influence the way that they operate, to encourage them to give young people a chance. I think probably age is the only category now where discrimination, particularly in the workplace, is acceptable. And often young people aren't given the opportunity. Of course, experience is really, really important. And wisdom and elders are important, but actually meritocracy is important too, and there are lots of young people that have got a huge amount to contribute in the context of leadership that simply don't get given the opportunity. We've done quite a lot of research looking in all kinds of different fields, from company directors, charity trustees, public appointments, councillors, MPs, and what you see is that young people are very significantly underrepresented in leadership roles. So obviously part of our job is to make sure that there's a good pipeline of young people coming through that have got the confidence and the ability to do that, but we also need to make sure that organisations are prepared and willing to receive them.
Okay. And are you a national organisation, or do you have international reach as well?
So we're predominantly national, but we're starting to explore international as well. I mean, we've always done bits and pieces of work in other places around the world, just kind of randomly really, but we're now starting to do that in a much more concerted way. And part of this has been driven really by the young people that we work with, who very much think of themselves as a generation globally. They don't necessarily narrowly define themselves in the context of the UK. So we've been starting to do some work both in Sierra Leone and Kenya, which has been really fascinating, and actually seeing that most of the challenges that are being faced, albeit the context is different, but the challenges are very similar. And I think what was particularly enlightening for me, we brought a group of young leaders from Kenya over here for 3 months recently, and what you get a lot of, I think, still in the international development world is, a sort of slightly colonial imperialist attitude. We'll go over and sort of help the natives. What was interesting about that was, I think the young people from Kenya were surprised to come here, spend 3 months in Birmingham and discover that there are homeless people in Birmingham. Mm-hmm. There are people with severe drug and alcohol issues in Birmingham. There's poverty in Birmingham. And so it was a really interesting kind of experience, I think. And I think they felt they probably had quite an idealised view of what the UK was like. Yeah. And the reciprocal learning and understanding at a leadership level, where slightly different cultural approaches to leadership. And that was really rich as well in terms of, I guess, to generalise, the young people from Kenya probably had a slightly more formal, slightly more structured approach. The young people from the UK probably had a slightly more informal approach. And that kind of mixing it up and learning from each other was really fascinating, and I think they all got a lot from that experience.
Okay. Now, in terms of context, I first met Adam just after the riots, not during the riots. We weren't participants, but just after the riots, we were part of a group that went to Downing Street to meet with the Prime Minister. And so I'm quite curious, how important do you think the government is in influencing youth policy and the work that we do with young people?
It's really interesting. I mean, I think, just to talk specifically about the riots for a moment, if we look at what's actually happened, very little. And it was interesting, particularly going to Kenya. In Kenya, they had very serious riots after the elections that were held there about 3 or 4 years ago. And what happened in Kenya was that they've actually created a whole programme of affirmative action because it was predominantly young people that were involved in that violence and civil disobedience. So they've created things like, they've got a youth commissioner, they've also got a system whereby in local government there's going to be a quota for local councillors under the age of 35, because what they recognise is that there is a massive gap in terms of young people's civic and civil engagement. What have we done here? Nothing really. And I don't necessarily put the responsibility for that totally at the doors of the government, because I think we tend to have a view that every issue, every problem, every challenge, the government has to sort it out, and I don't particularly subscribe to that. But I think I worry about what will happen this year and whether we'll see sort of the same thing happen. And I always hesitate to say that because there's a danger that people sort of stoke that up and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But certainly there's a very great sense of a generation of young people who feel completely like second-class citizens, and whether you look at that in terms of the massive problem of youth unemployment, the cost of education and debt, the inability to get on the housing ladder, and I suppose a sense that the country's in a massive amount of debt, and actually it's going to be this generation that pays for it. It was the previous generation's kind of credit card, and this generation's going to have to pay it off. And I don't think we've even begun to address that as a nation. And as I say, I think the government has a part to play in that, but I think we all have a part to play in that, really. And I just don't think it's not really being talked about. It's maybe being talked about in this context, in a sort of in a bit of a ghetto, but I don't think it's really being talked about more broadly. Other than, I mean, there are certain politicians I think that get it. So David Willits has written a book called The Pinch, which is really interesting, actually.
Okay.
Looking at this whole issue of the way in which the kind of baby boomer generation spent and spent and spent and spent and spent.
Yeah.
And now, you know, the current generation are having to deal with we're going to have to deal with the consequences of that. But it's a serious issue, you know, and I think it's probably one of the biggest issues that we have to face, because, you know, to have a generation of people who can't get into the labour market, you know, and it isn't. I don't even think it's necessarily a kind of class, social background based. You know, you see it across people from all backgrounds, and in some respects, particularly people that are coming out of university with massive amount of debt and can't get a job. Sooner or later, the frustration that causes is going to manifest itself in some way. And we need people working with young people, I think, are aware of that. But no one really seems to have come up with a good way of dealing with it.
I think, you know, I've spoken quite a few times about the kind of season of youth work that we're in, kind of like a winter season, and those who kind of prepared or knew what was going to come are kind of seizing the opportunities, but there's those who kind of didn't know that, you know, funding was going to dry up or how much debt you know, that we've managed to get ourselves into, and have become dependent on government funding, for example. And then when that's dried up, services have been kind of decimated. So can you talk a little bit about, although it's not the government responsibility, how would you describe where we are in the UK in terms of youth work?
Well, I think the problem really is that the youth work establishment, if I can put it in those terms, has chosen to create a sort of paradigm around funding, which is politically motivated, and it reflects the fact that the majority of people that work in this arena are, you know, generally left-wing and generally don't like the idea of there being a Tory government. So actually what that does, I think, is it fails young people, because, you know, you get into a political, big P, capital P political argument that kind of misses the point. I mean, yes, you know, you can argue about, for example, whether or not the government is right to be cutting public spending in the way that it is. I personally think it is. Other people have a different view about that, but the issues that we're talking about are far more fundamental. You know, there are issues around the housing market. There are issues around the labour market, because actually people are working longer, and notwithstanding the current economic problems we're having, that means, yeah, there's a discussion that we need to have about what are the implications of people working into their late 60s and early 70s on people entering the labour market. Now it's got nothing to do with cuts, you know, it's got nothing to do with the current political agenda. It's a simple demographic change that we're going through as a country, and I think we need to have a conversation about that, because and then, you know, what are the implications of people like my parents sitting in big houses and inflating the cost of buying a house for young people who want to enter the housing market. How do we deal with the fact that we have an ageing population, and therefore a significant burden is going to fall on younger people to pay the costs of that? So these are macro economic, macro political issues and people that work in the youth sector have chosen to engage instead in a sort of fairly petty political discussion about short-term funding cuts.
So where do you kind of believe investment, or should investment come around all services?
Well, most of the most successful youth initiatives of the last 100 years have not been of government. I mean, just look at the uniform organisations for a start. The Scouts will I'm sure, will carry on for another 100 years, regardless of who's in government. So I think we've all become dependent on government funding, and I think that's a really bad thing. I mean, Changemakers has. You know, we're as guilty of that as anyone else, and we're going through an adjustment at the moment of thinking, okay, well, how do we resource our work without being dependent on government?
What kind of things have you explored? So if someone's listening here and they're thinking, actually my organisation or the organisation I'm working for is quite government funding or government funded or dependent on a source of funding, what kind of things have you explored?
Well, I think what we've done is we've tried to really get clear about what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
Because like a lot of other national organisations in the sector, we became quite good at hoovering up big government contracts, and we grew very significantly. But then about 18 months ago, I mean, sort of before the last election, we started to ask ourselves the question, more like 2 years ago now, we started to ask ourselves the question, yeah, okay, we've become this kind of large delivery arm of government, but what are we actually trying to do? So we focus right down on leadership development, and even more now trying to focus down on what are the specific interventions and the specific inputs that will actually make a significant tangible difference, and make a significant tangible impact, rather than kind of thinking there are 40 of us, there are 40 mouths to feed, chase the money, which I think is what a lot of people do. And so I think the problem with the sloshing around of money that's happened over the last 10 or 15 years is that people got complacent, and they didn't really need to ask themselves the question about whether what they were doing was actually having any real impact. And that's not a good thing, and I think that's where the way that the additional funding of the last 10, 12 years has been invested has probably, I think it's been well intentioned, but I think it's actually skewed the market quite badly and caused people to do things that perhaps weren't necessarily having much effect, or at least not be able to really distinguish between the things that were really working and the things that weren't working. So, I mean, to answer your question, I think being really, really clear about what it is that you're trying to do and being able to really clearly demonstrate the impact of that, and we found that a challenging process to go through because we were just doing loads of things really, and it was kind of all felt quite good. But then you sort of start to look at it properly and say, well, you know, okay, we can do all these things and people will have a lovely time, but is that it? Is that all we're trying to? Are we just sort of giving people something fun to do, or are we actually trying to do something a bit more significant than that? And you know, if the government is funding it, then I think you've got to be able to demonstrate that you're doing a little bit more than that, really, rather than just sort of, you know, occupying people's time.
We've definitely been criticised by certain sections of the youth work community, and I know that you have as well, about kind of working with the private sector or encouraging a more private sector involvement in the funding of youth services, or at least partnerships. Can you talk a little bit about that, especially around the criticism? I think it's an important point around people are fearful, or some people are fearful, and they're kind of stoking up fear around the privatisation of youth work.
Well, I think what you see in the sort of unreconstituted public sector is a sanctification of people that work in the public sector. You know, they're all sort of they're all saints, and they're all on some kind of higher moral plane. And of course, that's in my view complete rubbish. I mean, you see it in the education sector as well. We're involved in in setting up a new free school, and I was speaking at a debate a couple of weeks ago about this, and there were a couple of people there who were talking about the privatisation of state education. I mean, I don't even really know what that means. My view would be that there are people in all walks of life that have a lot to offer to young people, and wherever they're coming from, we should welcome that support. I think what's important is that you ensure that people, whoever you're working with, that they're coming from a place where they've got a shared set of values. So, at Changemakers we have 5 values that underpin all of our work, and our test always, about who we work with, partner organisations, funders, staff, young people, would be, can you demonstrate that you share these values? And if you can, then we're pretty confident we can work together. The truth is that a lot of youth workers that I know don't fulfil those values, and they aren't the kind of people that I would want to work with. And the best bit of youth work I've seen in the last 6 months was at Sainsbury's. So I got invited to a dinner with Justin King, the Chief Executive of Sainsbury's, and they've set up, I mean, it hasn't even happened centrally, it's happened from the bottom up. A group of young employees have set up this amazing youth infrastructure across the company. And I think about 40% of their staff, of their management and above level staff, are under 25. So they've created this whole basic youth leadership structure across the company. They've got a direct line into the board, they report directly to the board, they've got people in every store that are involved. It's amazing, and it absolutely knocks into oblivion a lot of the stuff that so-called youth organisations are doing, and that's just happened organically and naturally. And when you hear Justin King speak about it, he just talks about the bottom line benefit. He says, why wouldn't we do this? We've got a lot of young staff. We've got a lot of young staff that are in leadership roles, and why would we not foster their engagement in the company? And when I think about a lot of the organisations that we go and work in to try and sort of persuade them to engage young people, they're not even at first base. Whereas Sainsbury's, it's just happened.
So it's about modelling best practice wherever it comes from, not necessarily just kind of insular. I think both Dave and I agree that there's kind of youth workers, it's kind of become insular. They're kind of just looking at ourselves, kind of very navel sort of gazing going on. But I think both of us, and there's been progressive youth workers, as if we want to call them that or label them that have said wherever best practice exists, let's start to model it. Whether it is from Sainsbury's or whether it be from Starbucks or whether it be from other youth services internationally.
I mean, we've just done at Changemakers, we've just done an awards scheme for employers, and we were looking for the best employers of young people in a kind of leadership context, and it was quite gratifying. We had a whole load of really big sort of multinational companies apply, and what they're doing is amazing. People in the leisure industry, hospitality particularly, giving young people fantastic development, and not just development in the context of the job that they have to do, but broader personal development and leadership development. That again, frankly, is way ahead of what a lot of youth organisations are doing. And I think we tend to think of, like, you think about sort of the engagement with the private sector. The government's obviously putting a lot of work into this at the moment in terms of, they've resourced a consortium to try and foster those links, and they're great. I'm glad they're doing that. But the thinking there tends to be about, let's get them to pay for stuff, when actually there are lots and lots of organisations that are not youth organisations that are doing outstanding work with young people that are never in these sorts of discussions. And actually, that's where, for me, that's where most of the interesting stuff is happening. And a lot of the thinking, I think, in the youth sector is pretty outdated, pretty outmoded.
How would you, and I know obviously some of the points here will be quite controversial, and I love that because I love controversy, it just stokes people out of that space. But how would you, Bob and I have always think that there's a revolution that needs to happen within this space around the thinking, and I know even without being politicised, I know the current youth minister thinks that there's way too many youth organisations in the space anyway, but regardless of numbers or what have you, how would you, or what would you think is important to revolutionise or shake up the way that organisations and youth workers across the board are delivering, which is quite a crucial service to young people? How would you say that?
I don't think you can. I don't really believe in top-down change. I don't think it works.
Yeah.
The last government tried to do a lot of that in a lot of different areas, and it didn't really work. So I think, in a sense, that one of the good things about the current government is that they understand the limitations of government. Actually, they're quite realistic about, and this isn't a sort of big government versus small government thing. It's just about realistically what can government actually achieve. So, my answer to your question, Dave, would be it's got to be bottom up. It's got to be about empowering young people to help themselves in the broadest sense. Now that means in some cases helping them to actually set their own things up and support their peers, or be better able to articulate and have an influence over, if there is money being spent, how it's being spent. We're working in Islington at the moment, and we're running a couple of youth hubs there on behalf of the council, and what we're trying to do there is make them completely youth-led, so that all of the activity that goes on there, all of the services that are delivered, to use that terminology, are decided and determined by young people. So I think that, I always believe that the way that you drive change is through giving the recipients of the services the power, because if you do that, then the kind of vested interests will be demolished. Because actually, and again, I'm very much involved in this in the education sector as well. In education, what you have is a system where schools and government decide what people want, and it's a bit like going into a shop in communist Russia and going in, and there's one thing on the shelf that you can choose from. What we're trying to do is say, actually, let's create some proper choice, and let's actually let children and parents decide what kind of schools they want. And I think the same is true in the youth sector. I'm a big advocate of individual budgets and that kind of thing. I'd like to see every young person have a pot that they can spend where they want to spend it. They might choose to spend it in their local authority-run youth club, or they might choose to spend it in Starbucks, or they might choose to spend it in the local cinema, or they might choose to spend it in the local football club. Give them the power to actually decide what they want.
But that is quite revolutionary, though, isn't it? Because if you think about it, if you think about it historically, it has been quite top down, and I'm sure all of us have been guilty of this in some way. Where we've come here, we want to help the young people, we want to save them, what have you. We've got these great ideas, but being in that space where your position of leadership is more as a facilitator, as opposed to saying, right, okay, I've got this grand vision, and everybody's going to follow, is quite revolutionary.
And how many of us, Changemakers, we do this sometimes. We're dragging people off the streets. Crazy, people are perfectly capable of making an informed decision about, they do it with their mobile phone. They do it with their portable devices. They do it with their clothes. They do it with their media. They're perfectly capable of doing that. So really, the only thing that's stopping that from happening is a massive amount of vested interest of, gosh, what will actually happen if we allow people to choose? They might not choose us. They might not want what we're giving them.
Talking about vested interest, what's your views around the kind of Institute of Youth Work? Is that what it's called? The kind of proposed Institute of Work?
I think it's a complete nonsense. I've said
well,
this.
Tell us what you honestly think.
I said this to the Education Select Committee. I was called to give evidence to the Education Select Committee. This is about professional protectionism. This is about trying to stop people who don't meet some kind of arbitrarily defined criteria from being able to work with young people. I always used to like what Sean Bailey said. He always used to say,
let's pause right now.
Yeah. Okay. He always says, I remember speaking at an event with him and him saying that all of the worst things that he'd ever seen in whatever, however many years of working with young people, all of the worst acts have been committed by so-called professional youth workers. All of the worst breaches of protocol, all of the, his words, not mine. But there is certainly, there is a truism. Why do we want to professionalise? The driver for professionalisation comes from people who work in this arena. It doesn't come from young people. Young people couldn't care less, I would suspect. And I don't even think parents would really care, actually, because that's another hook that this is hung on, that there's some kind of public confidence. I don't think there's a lack of public confidence. I don't see people having a lack of confidence in the Scouts. Do people have a lack of confidence? I don't think so.
How would you respond to kind of increasing or maintaining standards, or ensuring quality and things like that? That's the kind of response that I hear from people that are around professional qualifications. Again, it depends whether you think that the way to do that is from the top down or from the bottom up. I mean, what I know is that as a parent, is that I can make pretty informed choices about my daughter's 5, right? So I can make pretty informed choices. She does various clubs and activities. I can make pretty informed choices. It's not, and I don't go and say, has this person got a qualification? I trust my instincts. I talk to other parents, and I make a choice. I make a decision on that basis. And I think that's what happens. People know the market generally has pretty good intelligence, wisdom of crowds, and all that. Mm-hmm. People know whether things are good. And so I don't think that doing it would provide any greater quality assurance than what we've got now.
I'm going to throw an accountant to that, because we love this. And I think that a lot of people who are in the space need to raise their game.
Yeah.
I think that they need to raise their game around how the youth work is provided, how we give that space to young people to be able to do stuff. So say, for example, I think a lot of youth workers need to take responsibility for what happened last year in the riots, because we are those pivotal space between parents not being present or teachers failing or lack of authority. One other avenue that people would turn to are youth workers. And I think that there is need, not necessarily to say, I've gone off and done a degree for 2 years and learned safeguarding or what have you, but I think that there should be some kind of, almost like you said, the wisdom of the crowd, some way that you can, and I'm really passionate about it, sharing best practice, because there are a lot of people who are going to youth work and set up a youth club. Everybody goes in there, smokes a split, plays snooker, and they say, I'm a youth worker. And I think that the individuals who are in that space, and there's a massive responsibility of working with young people, that they need to raise their game. And I'm not necessarily saying that you have to go out there and have youth work or YSA at the bottom of your name, but there needs to be some raising. So whilst personally, I agree with you, I'm not a big fan of the Institute of Youth Work, I'm quite curious as to how you think that...
I agree with you, but what you're talking about is thought leadership, which is needed, it's necessary. I've for the last 3 years, I've been a council member of the General Teaching Council. What the General Teaching Council, and the General Teaching Council has been abolished by the government, what the GTC did well was it was very good, I think, at influencing the kind of notion of what teaching should be in that kind of context of thought leadership. What actually has been much less successful has been the regulatory side of what it does. Not because it didn't discharge that responsibility well, because it was highly effective and highly professional in the way that it did that. But actually, has it raised standards in the profession? I would very much question whether it has. So I think, yes, the idea of a game-raising, thought leadership, sort of self-organising agenda for change and raising the game, as you say, would be a good thing. But I think trying to make that into a quality assurance process where somebody is sitting there in judgment and saying, yes, you are, no, you're not, that is... Because what you'll end up with, you can absolutely guarantee what you'll end up with is a very narrowly defined idea. I mean, we're having this with the school that I mentioned before. I'm very keen to get a broader range of people into the classroom. Now I recognise that what you need to have at the centre of that is a qualified teacher that understands the pedagogy of teaching. But actually, there are lots of people that could do a fantastic job in the classroom under that guidance and provide rich content for the children at the school that we're opening. And of course, what I'm guessing is a massive amount of attack from the teaching unions who will say, no, you can't do that. And the only reason for that is just about it's pure protectionism. So it's not for me to say that there isn't a craft involved in, being a good youth worker. Although I don't really like the word youth worker, or being a good teacher. Of course there is, but I would say it's a pretty broad church. It's a broader church in youth work than it is in teaching. That's something I think we should try and safeguard. Not narrow it down so that there's a sort of a very narrow
like
view.
An offset for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I don't see. I would just say, where's the demand for this coming from?
Yeah.
It's only coming from people who are youth workers who have this kind of idea around professional status because they think it will somehow protect them in some way.
I've got some questions around kind of.
Yeah. Because we can kill it.
Yeah. What I wanted to do is, because I think we could probably speak for a couple more hours around policy and different agendas around this, but I wanted to speak to kind of like Adam as the man, if you like, and kind of where are you coming from in this? We know that you're an intelligent individual. What's bringing you towards youth work? Where's the passion come from you?
Well, I guess, funny enough, someone asked me this question yesterday. Anyone had asked me that for a long time before that. I think the fire in my belly is around the top-down nature of society. So I think that we need a more bottom-up world, and I think that what may have worked 50 or 100 years ago won't work now. And if you look at most of the problems that we have in society, they are caused by over-centralisation, top-down thinking. So I suppose what brings me to this, what makes me passionate and excited about an organisation like Changemakers is that we're empowering people. We're giving people the tools and the confidence to make a change for themselves. And if you can create a critical mass of people who think in that way, then society will change. People often say to me, why don't you go into politics? Why don't you become an MP or whatever? And apart from the fact that I can think of nothing worse than being in that environment, I also think that the ability of governments to change things is pretty limited. And again, in a different era, in a different time, you could sort of crank the levers in Whitehall or Westminster and make stuff happen. And I think successive governments have found, if you read Tony Blair's memoirs, this is one of the big things that he says, actually how little he felt able to achieve, which was probably why he kind of went off and started messing around in different parts of the world, because he probably could have a bit more power and influence there, but actually trying to get stuff to shift. So for me, it's about creating a movement for change. It's about it's not about sort of saying this is what the world should be like. It's about saying you need to decide what the world looks like, and our role is to enable you to be able to do that, to create that platform for you to be able to make the change. Okay. So that's what fires me really. That's what makes me excited.
So my last question, and I'll hand it to end it, is we joked about hope as always. Yeah. But what are your hopes for our field or our tribe or whatever, however what we're working in, the kind of broad church of youth work? What kind of hopes do you have?
I guess I hope that we start to define the tribe much, if you want to use that terminology, much more broadly. That it's a much more diverse tribe. Because as I mentioned before, I think there are all sorts of people doing amazing work with young people, that would never in a million years define themselves as a youth worker and are completely off the radar of the youth sector getting, as I tend to think of it. So I think that would be my main hope, would be that we try and kind of diversify, and I think that in turn will stimulate a different kind of mindset and a different kind of attitude, and going back to what you said, David, a kind of raising of the game. Those other sorts of influences, because I think it's people who think pretty much the same stuff talking to each other, doesn't tend to create a very dynamic, radical agenda.
Well, I can say that personally, I think you live up to the name of your company, that whole Changemakers. It should be called Rabble Rousers, not Changemakers. But I love that because I think it's really refreshing as well, because you're leading, you're defining leadership, you're leading from the front as well. Well, my last question is to you though, is in terms of what you do, how easy is it to be replicated?
This is a really interesting question, something that we're grappling with. Historically, we've been very, very poor at doing that, and we're trying to get better. And the way that we think we can replicate what we do is through empowering our alumni to take it on. And I've talked a lot about loosening the ties and loosening control, and we're as guilty as anyone else of wanting to hold on to stuff and guard it. So what we're trying to do at the moment is move towards a model where there's a sort of pay it forward idea, and people want to feel motivated after going through our programme to come back and keep it going. So I think that's the only way. When you're talking about something that's very much based around values, you need to have people that have kind of been through that experience themselves and understand and live those values to then transmit that to other people. So I think we're moving towards being able to do that much more effectively than we have been. But it's not easy. And again, I think it comes down to empowering people. It goes back to the stuff we've discussed around funding. A lot of what a lot of people deliver, including us, is very expensive, actually, and it needs to be. Realistically, it needs to be more cost effective, and therefore we need to involve young people in feeling like they're part of the solution of spreading it.
Okay. Anything that you want to mention that you don't think we spoke about in this session at all?
I could go on forever.
Okay.
I think there's the final point about someone who's watching this, someone's listening to this is a youth worker, challenging times or changing times for sure. What kind of message, not necessarily words of wisdom, what kind of message, what would you like to be able to say to them? Because our hope or our aim and outcome is to be able to get this to people that are feeling a little bit separate, knowing that there's changes to come from, and kind of looking at people who are the movers and shakers, people who are making changes in there.
I would say necessity is the motherhood of invention. If you look at any major innovation or social change that's ever happened, it tends to happen in difficult times. And there's a much clearer, blanker canvas now than there was 3 or 4 years ago. So if you're someone that's got an idea or wants to try and do something differently, it's a great opportunity to do it. I think the failure of the youth sector over the last 3 or 4 years has not been to grasp that opportunity. So I think, we've set up a lot of meetings in the last couple of years, and it's a great time to do that, because, okay, funding may be an issue, but actually in terms of the sort of bumping up against the orthodoxy, everything's being shaken up. So it's a good time to position new ideas and new thinking, I think, and people I find people are quite receptive to that. So I think it's a time of hope.
That's a great place. That's a great. I think we're done. I think that's a great.
I just want to thank Adam. It's been an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed it. We could have gone on for ages. I'm sure we will continue our conversations on it anymore. And I would like to say, can you tell us where they want to find out more? People want to find out more about what Changemakers does. Yeah. Where can they go?
So go to changemakers.org.uk.
Okay. Yeah. And for those of you who don't know, you can put a www in front of it or an HTTP just in case. And you can find out about the brilliant stuff that they've been doing. It's been an absolute pleasure. I know Bob and I have enjoyed ourselves. Sure. We're going to go and edit this down and try and make it. Yeah, right. It's very good to be in the Arsenal space, but have a fellow Liverpool supporter up in here. Go. Absolutely. You will never walk alone. But on that final note,
I'm sure that's not going to be the final note. But thanks for tuning in, and hopefully you'll tune in next time.
okay.